The tears wouldn't stop falling as Josephine Miller stared helplessly at the broken wagon wheel, her wedding dress now caked with dust and despair. The Montana Territory of 1876 had no mercy for a bride abandoned at the altar, or rather, 5 miles from it. The spring sun beat down mercilessly as Josephine wiped her tear-stained face with her lace handkerchief, now as dirty as her once pristine gown. Her fiancé, Thomas, had fled with his former sweetheart after having second thoughts, leaving Josephine stranded on the trail to Silver Creek. The wagon driver, whom Thomas had paid, simply shrugged his shoulders, unhitched his horse, and rode away after the wheel cracked against a jagged rock. "I'll send help," he'd muttered, but Josephine knew that was a lie. Now she sat on her trunk, surrounded by her worldly possessions, a few dresses, books, a quilt her mother had made, and wedding gifts from her family back east. The nearest town was at least 10 miles away, and she hadn't seen another soul for hours. A cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, and Josephine stood, squinting against the sun. A lone rider approached, his silhouette growing clearer as he neared. Her heart raced with both hope and fear. The West was no place for a woman alone, and strangers could mean salvation or danger. The rider slowed his chestnut stallion to a walk as he approached. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered tan that spoke of years under the open sky. His dark hair curled from beneath a worn hat, and his eyes, a piercing blue, surveyed the scene with calm assessment. "Afternoon, madam," he said, his voice deep and measured. "Seems you found yourself in quite a predicament." Josephine straightened her spine, trying to maintain some dignity despite her disheveled appearance. "The wheel broke. The driver left. I was on my way to be married." The stranger's gaze took in her tear-streaked face, the white dress, and the broken wagon. Understanding dawned in his eyes. "And the groom?" he asked quietly. "Decided another woman suited him better," she replied, her voice breaking despite her best efforts. The cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion, tying his horse to the wagon before examining the broken wheel. After a thorough inspection, he shook his head. "That's beyond repair out here," he said, turning to face her. "I'm Samuel Erikson. I've got a ranch about 5 miles west." "Josephine Miller," she replied, offering her hand as propriety demanded, though it seemed absurd given the circumstances. Samuel took her hand briefly, his calloused palm warm against her skin. He glanced at her belongings, then back at the setting sun. "Night's coming. Coyotes and worse will be out soon." He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "Miss Miller, I can't fix this wagon today, and you can't stay here alone. My ranch isn't much, but it's safe." He untied his horse and guided it closer to where she stood. With gentle determination, he adjusted the stirrups and hitched his thumb toward the saddle. "Ride home with me," he said simply. "Tomorrow we can figure out what's to be done about your situation." Josephine hesitated, weighing her limited options. Stay alone on the trail as darkness fell, or trust this stranger who seemed genuine in his offer of help. "My things," she began. "We'll cover them with the wagon canvas. Nobody comes this way much, and I'll send my ranch hand back for them first thing tomorrow." His practical response quieted her protest. With a nod, she gathered her skirts and moved toward the horse. "What about your wedding gifts?" Samuel asked, nodding toward the small pile. "They weren't for me," she said quietly. "Not anymore." Understanding flickered in his eyes. Without another word, he helped her mount the horse, his hands respectful but steady as he lifted her. Once she was settled, he secured her small valise behind the saddle and retrieved a wool blanket from his saddlebag, wrapping it around her shoulders. "The evening brings a chill," he explained, then took the reins and began leading the horse on foot. "You're walking?" Josephine asked, surprised. Samuel glanced up at her with the ghost of a smile. "Thunder here is strong, but he's carried me all day. No need to burden him with both of us when I've got 2 good legs." As they set off, the sun began its descent, painting the vast Montana sky in hues of orange and pink. Josephine, perched atop the horse with a stranger walking beside her, felt an odd mixture of relief and trepidation. What awaited her at Samuel Erikson's ranch, she couldn't know. But whatever it was, it had to be better than being left crying beside a broken wagon as night fell on the unforgiving prairie. The twilight deepened as they traveled, and Josephine found herself studying Samuel Erikson's profile. His jaw was strong and set with determination, his eyes scanning the horizon regularly. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to the harsh realities of frontier life. "You're not from around here," he observed after they had traveled in silence for some time. "No," she replied. "I'm from Boston. I came west 3 months ago to marry Thomas. We had been corresponding for nearly a year." Samuel nodded, understanding dawning in his expression. Mail-order marriages weren't uncommon in these parts, where women were scarce and men outnumbered them significantly. "You traveled all this way to marry a man you'd never met?" There was no judgment in his tone, merely curiosity. "I had met him, briefly," she explained. "He came east on business last year. We were introduced at a social gathering, and he began writing to me afterward." She paused, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "I suppose I should have known better than to trust in such a brief acquaintance." Samuel was quiet for a moment before responding. "The West makes people desperate for connection, Miss Miller. You're not the first to trust too quickly, and you won't be the last." His words, though not particularly comforting, lacked the pity she'd dreaded. For that, at least, she was grateful. "Do you have family back in Boston?" he asked. "My mother passed 2 years ago. My father remarried quickly, and his new wife made it clear there wasn't room for a grown stepdaughter." She hadn't meant to reveal so much to a stranger, but something about the vast openness around them made secrets seem pointless. Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "So no one to return to?" It wasn't a question, but Josephine answered anyway. No one. And nowhere near enough money for the journey, even if there were. They continued in silence for a while, the only sounds the rhythmic hoofbeats of thunder and the occasional call of a night bird. In the distance, a coyote howled, and Josephine shivered despite the blanket. "Almost there," Samuel assured her, pointing to a faint glow of light ahead. "That's the ranch house." As they drew closer, Josephine could make out the shape of a substantial log cabin with a covered porch wrapping around 2 sides. Warm light spilled from the windows, and smoke curled from the stone chimney. To the side stood a large barn and several smaller outbuildings, all well maintained. A dog began barking as they approached, and the door to the cabin opened, revealing a silhouette. "That's late even for you, Sam," called a woman's voice. "Supper's been keeping warm for hours." "We have a guest." "Martha," Samuel replied as they reached the yard. "Miss Josephine Miller." The woman stepped out onto the porch, and Josephine could see she was older, perhaps in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and a kind face lined with the wisdom of years. "Land sakes, child," Martha exclaimed, taking in Josephine's disheveled wedding dress. "What on earth happened to you?" Samuel offered a brief explanation as he helped Josephine dismount. Her legs, stiff from the ride, nearly buckled, and he steadied her with a firm hand at her elbow. Martha's expression shifted from shock to sympathy to determination in the span of seconds. "Well, you're safe now, dear. Come inside and get warm. I've got stew that'll put some color back in those cheeks." She ushered Josephine toward the door, her motherly manner brooking no argument. Samuel remained behind to tend to thunder, promising to join them shortly. The cabin's interior was surprisingly spacious and welcoming. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with comfortable-looking chairs arranged before it. The wooden floors were partially covered with woven rugs, and kerosene lamps cast a warm glow over the simple but solid furniture. "This is lovely," Josephine said honestly, looking around at the well-kept home. Martha nodded with pride. "Been keeping house for Sam since his parents passed, God rest their souls, 10 years now." She guided Josephine to a chair near the fire. "Sit there and warm yourself while I fetch you some clean clothes. You look to be about my niece's size, and she left some things here last visit." Before Josephine could protest, Martha disappeared into another room, returning moments later with a simple cotton dress and undergarments. "Bathroom's through there," she said, pointing to a door. "We've got running water thanks to Sam's contraption with the windmill. It's cold, mind you, but I've set a kettle warming if you'd like to wash up properly." Overwhelmed by the kindness, Josephine felt tears threatening again. "I don't know how to thank you." Martha patted her shoulder. "No thanks needed. Now go get changed while I dish up some stew. You look half-starved." In the small but tidy bathroom, Josephine peeled off her ruined wedding dress with a mixture of regret and relief. The dress represented dreams now shattered, yet there was something liberating about shedding it. She washed quickly, the warm water Martha provided a luxury after her ordeal, and changed into the borrowed clothes. When she emerged, Samuel had returned and was seated at the table, his hat hung on a peg by the door. He stood when she entered, a gesture of respect that seemed so civilized compared to the wilderness outside. "Feel better?" he asked, his eyes noting the transformation with approval. "Much, thank you," she replied, self-consciously touching her hair, which she'd loosened from its elaborate style and re-braided simply. Martha set a steaming bowl of stew before her, along with a chunk of fresh bread. "Eat now, talk later," she instructed, and Josephine obeyed, suddenly aware of her hunger. The meal was delicious, hearty beef stew with vegetables from what must be a kitchen garden and bread still warm from the oven. Samuel ate with the focused appreciation of a man who worked hard for his meals, while Martha bustled about, refilling coffee cups and adding more bread to the table. Only when Josephine had emptied her bowl did Samuel speak again. "Miss Miller, you're welcome to stay here until you decide what you want to do next," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "I have a spare room, and it's no trouble." "I couldn't impose," she began, but Martha interrupted. "Nonsense. Where else would you go, child? Besides, it would be nice to have another woman around this place. Too much male company makes a person forget how to be civilized." Samuel raised an eyebrow at Martha, but didn't contradict her. "Tomorrow I'll send Jake to collect your things from the wagon. Is there anything in particular you need right away?" Josephine thought of her trunk, with the few precious keepsakes from her mother and the practical necessities she'd brought for her new life. "There's a small blue valise with personal items, a hairbrush, some letters, a daguerreotype of my mother." Samuel nodded. "I'll make sure he knows to bring that first." Martha began clearing the dishes, waving away Josephine's attempt to help. "You rest, dear. There's plenty of time for helping tomorrow." As Martha disappeared into the kitchen, Samuel leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "Miss Miller, I should explain that my ranch is somewhat isolated. The nearest town, Silver Creek, is 15 miles east, and while I make trips there for supplies every couple of weeks, it's not an easy journey." "I understand," Josephine replied, trying to appear more composed than she felt. "I won't be a burden to you any longer than necessary, Mr. Erikson. As soon as I can secure some form of employment." "That wasn't my meaning," he interrupted gently. "You're welcome here as long as needed. I simply wanted you to understand your situation clearly. The West can be unforgiving to those unprepared for its realities." His consideration touched her. "You've already shown me more kindness than I had any right to expect from a stranger, Mr. Erikson." "Samuel, please," he said. "Or Sam. We're not much for formalities out here." "Then you must call me Josephine." She hesitated. "Or Josie. That's what my friends called me, before." "Josie," he repeated, as if testing the name. "It suits you." Martha returned with coffee and 3 slices of apple pie, effectively ending their conversation. As they enjoyed the dessert, Martha regaled Josephine with stories of ranch life that, despite their sometimes harrowing nature, were told with enough humor to keep them from frightening her outright. By the time the meal concluded, exhaustion had caught up with Josephine. Martha showed her to a small but comfortable bedroom with a patchwork quilt on the bed and a small window overlooking the eastern plains. "Sleep as long as you need," Martha said, placing a pitcher of water and a basin on the dresser. "No one expects you to be up with the chickens after what you've been through." Left alone, Josephine sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself to fully process the day's events. She had lost a fiancé, been abandoned on the trail, and found refuge with strangers who had shown her more kindness in a few hours than Thomas had in months of correspondence. Outside her window, the vast Montana sky sparkled with stars, more than she'd ever seen in Boston. The enormity of her situation, stranded in the West, with no plan and few resources, should have terrified her. Yet somehow, in this snug cabin with the steady presence of Samuel Erikson and the motherly Martha nearby, Josephine felt something she hadn't expected: hope. With that surprising comfort, she lay down on the unfamiliar bed and fell into the deepest sleep she'd had since leaving Boston. The aroma of coffee and bacon roused Josephine from sleep. For a moment she was disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, but then the events of the previous day rushed back. She was not in Silver Creek preparing for her wedding, but in the home of a stranger who had rescued her from abandonment. Sunlight streamed through the small window, suggesting it was well into morning. Embarrassed at having slept so late, Josephine quickly rose, washed her face in the basin, and dressed in the borrowed clothes from the previous evening. She plaited her hair neatly and pinched some color into her cheeks before emerging from the bedroom. Martha was bustling around the kitchen, humming as she worked. She turned at the sound of Josephine's footsteps, her face breaking into a warm smile. "There you are, child. I was beginning to think you might sleep the day away, not that you haven't earned the rest." She gestured to the table where a place was set. "Sit down and I'll fix you some breakfast." "I'm so sorry to be late," Josephine apologized, taking the offered seat. "I'm not usually so indolent." Martha waved away her concern. "Nonsense. After what you've been through, you needed the sleep." She placed a steaming cup of coffee before Josephine. "Samuel and Jake left at first light to retrieve your belongings. They should be back by midday." As if summoned by her words, the sound of horses approached the cabin. Martha peered out the window and nodded. "That's them now, and good timing too. The clouds are gathering to the west. We may have rain by evening." Josephine rose, eager to see what had been salvaged from her abandoned wagon. She stepped onto the porch just as Samuel and another man, presumably Jake, rode into the yard, leading a pack horse laden with her trunk and several bundles. Samuel dismounted with fluid grace, removing his hat as he approached the porch. "Good morning, Miss Miller Josie," he corrected himself. "I trust you slept well?" "Very well, thank you," she replied, unable to suppress a smile at his remembered use of her familiar name. "And I see you've rescued my possessions." "Most of them," he confirmed. "The wagon canvas kept everything dry, and nothing appeared to be missing. Jake and I brought what we could carry safely." Jake, a lanky young man with a shock of red hair, nodded respectfully in her direction. "Madam, sorry about your troubles." "Thank you for your help, mister." "Just Jake, madam. Jake Patterson." He seemed uncomfortable with formality, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Samuel gestured toward the loaded pack horse. "We'll bring everything to the porch for now. You can sort through it at your leisure and decide what you need inside." As the men unloaded her belongings, Josephine felt a wave of gratitude. These strangers were going to considerable trouble for her, and she had nothing to offer in return except her thanks. Martha appeared at the door, wiping her hands on her apron. "Bring that trunk straight to Josie's room, Samuel. No sense leaving her clothes to gather dust on the porch." Samuel complied without argument, lifting the heavy trunk with apparent ease and carrying it inside. Jake followed with the smaller valise Josephine had mentioned the night before, and several bundles wrapped in oilcloth. Once everything was situated, Martha insisted everyone sit down for a late breakfast. Jake appeared hesitant until Samuel nodded encouragingly, and then the young man took a seat at the table, his manner suggesting he wasn't accustomed to dining in the main house. Over plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits, Josephine learned more about her hosts. Samuel had inherited the ranch from his father 8 years ago, after both his parents succumbed to influenza within weeks of each other. Martha, who had been the local schoolteacher before retiring, had come to help temporarily and never left. Jake, an orphan from Silver Creek, had been working for Samuel for 3 years, starting when he was just 16. "The E-bar-E isn't the biggest spread in the territory," Samuel explained, "but we manage. We run about 500 head of cattle, keep some horses, and grow enough to feed ourselves." "Sam's being modest," Martha interjected. "The E-bar-E is one of the most respected ranches in the county. His father built it from nothing, and Samuel has nearly doubled its size since taking over." Samuel's expression remained impassive, but Josephine detected a hint of pride in his eyes at Martha's praise. "What about you, Miss Miller?" Jake asked, seemingly gaining confidence. "Were you really left at the altar?" "Jake," Martha scolded, but Josephine shook her head. "It's all right, and please call me Josie." She took a sip of coffee before continuing. "I wasn't left at the altar exactly. My fiancé had a change of heart before we reached Silver Creek." She explained briefly about her correspondence with Thomas, her journey west, and the events leading to her abandonment on the trail. "The man's a coward," Samuel said quietly when she finished, his first direct comment on her situation. "No honorable man treats a woman that way, especially one who's traveled so far on his account." His indignation on her behalf warmed Josephine unexpectedly. "It seems I had a fortunate escape, though it didn't feel that way yesterday." "What will you do now?" Jake asked, earning another reproving look from Martha. It was a question Josephine had been asking herself since waking. "I'm not entirely sure," she admitted. "I have some savings, but not enough for passage back east, even if I had somewhere to go there. I'll need to find work, I suppose." "There's not much employment for women in these parts," Samuel said thoughtfully. "The saloon in Silver Creek hires girls, but—" He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable suggesting such a position. "I was a teacher's assistant in Boston," Josephine offered, "and I'm skilled with a needle. Perhaps there's a school or a dressmaker in need of help." Martha and Samuel exchanged glances. "Silver Creek's too small for a proper school yet," Martha explained, "and Mrs. Whitaker does the dressmaking, but she works alone." The silence that followed made Josephine's predicament clear. Without skills immediately valuable in this frontier setting, her options were severely limited. Samuel cleared his throat. "There's no rush to decide anything. You're welcome here while you consider your next steps." "That's very generous, but I can't impose indefinitely," Josephine protested. "It's no imposition," Martha assured her. "In fact, I could use the help around here. These men create more work than they realize." Samuel raised an eyebrow, but didn't contradict her. "Martha's right, and I pay fair wages for fair work, if that's what concerns you." The offer stunned Josephine. It solved her immediate problem, yet raised new concerns about propriety. A single woman living and working on a ranch with unmarried men would raise eyebrows even in the relatively flexible moral structure of the frontier. Martha, seemingly reading her thoughts, added, "No one would question it with me here as chaperone. I may be just the housekeeper, but folks around here know I run a respectable household." "You're far more than a housekeeper, Martha," Samuel said with genuine affection, "and your reputation for propriety is unimpeachable." The older woman smiled at the compliment. "Well then, it's settled. Josie will stay and help me with the house and garden. It'll give her time to learn about life out here before she makes any permanent decisions." Josephine looked from Martha's hopeful expression to Samuel's steady gaze and Jake's encouraging nod. These people owed her nothing, yet were offering her a lifeline when she most needed one. "Thank you," she said finally. "I accept, at least for now, and I promise to earn my keep." Samuel nodded once, as if concluding a business arrangement. "Good. Now that's settled, Jake and I have work to do." He rose from the table, placing his hat back on his head. "The north pasture fence needs mending before the rain comes." Jake quickly followed suit, thanking Martha for breakfast before following Samuel out the door. Left alone with Martha, Josephine immediately began helping clear the table. "You don't have to start earning your keep this minute," Martha chuckled, though she accepted the assistance. "I want to," Josephine replied. Idle hands were never permitted in my mother's home. As they washed dishes together, Martha told Josephine more about the ranch and its routines. The E-Bar E employed 3 other hands besides Jake, all of whom lived in the bunkhouse by the barn. They took their meals there except for Sunday dinner, which Martha served in the main house as a weekly tradition. Samuel's father started that practice, she explained, said breaking bread together once a week reminded everyone they were part of something larger than themselves. "It sounds like Mr. Erikson, the elder Mr. Erikson, was a wise man," Josephine observed. "James Erikson was the finest man I've ever known, aside from his son," Martha agreed. "Built this place with nothing but determination and hard work. Samuel is cut from the same cloth, stubborn as a mule sometimes, but fair and honorable to a fault. He seems very capable, Josephine said carefully, not wanting to appear too interested in her benefactor. Martha's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled. Samuel is the most capable man in 3 counties, though you won't hear him say so. He could have had his pick of the local girls, but he's never shown much interest in courting. Perhaps he's devoted to his work, Josephine suggested. Perhaps, Martha agreed, though her tone suggested she had her own theories. Or perhaps he's been waiting for something or someone worth setting work aside for. Before Josephine could respond to this provocative statement, Martha changed the subject, asking about Josephine's skills and interests. The morning passed quickly as they finished the dishes, prepared a stew for the evening meal, and began sorting through Josephine's belongings to determine what needed washing or mending after the journey. The blue valise Samuel had ensured was retrieved contained Josephine's most precious possessions, her mother's silver hairbrush and hand mirror, a small daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day, letters from her childhood friend Emma, and a well-worn copy of Pride and Prejudice that had been her mother's favorite novel. Martha examined each item with appropriate reverence, understanding their significance without explanation. When they came to the wedding dress, now crumpled and stained, Martha shook her head. "Such fine work, wasted on a man who didn't deserve it," she said, running her fingers over the delicate lace trim. "We should try to salvage the fabric at least. Good silk is hard to come by out here." Josephine nodded, though the thought of cutting up the dress that had represented so many hopes brought a lump to her throat. "Perhaps later. I don't think I'm ready yet." Martha patted her hand. "Of course, dear. There's no rush." By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had indeed gathered to the west and the air felt heavy with impending rain. Martha and Josephine moved to the kitchen to prepare a heartier supper than originally planned, anticipating that Samuel and Jake would return cold and hungry from their work in the field. "The first rain of spring is always the most welcome," Martha commented as she chopped carrots for the stew. "It washes away the last of winter and promises new growth." Josephine, kneading dough for biscuits, considered the metaphor. Perhaps this unexpected detour in her life's journey was like the spring rain washing away plans that weren't meant to be and preparing the ground for something new to grow. As the storm clouds rolled closer, she found herself glancing repeatedly out the window, watching for Samuel's return. The concern surprised her. She barely knew the man, yet already his safety mattered to her in a way she couldn't quite explain. The first heavy drops of rain were just beginning to fall when Samuel and Jake rode into the yard, their figures silhouetted against the darkening sky. Josephine felt an inexplicable relief at the sight, quickly followed by embarrassment at her reaction. What was it about this taciturn rancher that affected her so strongly after just one day? As Samuel entered, removing his hat and rain-dampened coat, his eyes met hers briefly. Something flickered in their blue depths, surprise, perhaps, or pleasure at finding her waiting. Then the moment passed, and he was greeting Martha, asking about supper, and moving to wash up at the basin by the door, his manner as practical and composed as ever. Yet Josephine couldn't help noticing how the kitchen seemed suddenly smaller with his presence, as if his quiet strength filled the space in a way that both intimidated and intrigued her. And when he turned to ask how she was settling in, his deep voice pitched low for her alone, Josephine realized with a jolt that her journey might have led her exactly where she was meant to be, though not in the way she had expected. The rain fell steadily through the night, drumming a soothing rhythm on the cabin roof. Josephine lay awake for a time, listening to the sound and reflecting on the strange turn her life had taken. Just 2 days ago, she'd been traveling toward what she thought would be her future as a wife in Silver Creek. Now she found herself employed as a housekeeper's assistant on a cattle ranch, with no clear path forward. Yet despite the uncertainty, she felt an unexpected sense of peace. Samuel Erikson's home, though simple, radiated a warmth and security she hadn't experienced since before her mother's death. Martha's motherly presence eased the ache of loneliness that had been her constant companion since leaving Boston. and Samuel himself. Josephine turned restlessly in her bed, trying to make sense of her conflicted feelings about the rancher. His kindness was evident, yet he maintained a certain reserve that made him difficult to read. Was he merely being charitable to a woman in distress, or was there something more behind those piercing blue eyes when they rested on her? Such thoughts were premature and inappropriate, she chided herself. Her fiancé had abandoned her just yesterday, hardly the time to be noticing another man's attributes, no matter how admirable they might be. With that firm resolution, Josephine finally drifted to sleep, lulled by the steady rainfall and the knowledge that, at least for now, she was safe. The next morning dawned clear and fresh, the storm having washed everything clean. Determined to prove her worth, Josephine rose early and was already helping Martha prepare breakfast when Samuel entered the kitchen. He paused in the doorway, surprise evident in his expression at finding her up and working. "Good morning," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "You're an early riser." "On most days," she replied, suddenly self-conscious under his steady gaze. "I hope we didn't wake you." "I've been up since before dawn," he said, moving to pour himself coffee. "Just checking the north pasture again. The storm brought down some branches on the fence line." Martha placed a platter of flapjacks on the table. "You didn't ride out in the dark, did you, Samuel? That ridge is treacherous enough in daylight." His slight smile held affection. "Your concern is noted, Martha, but unnecessary. I waited for first light." As they ate breakfast, Samuel outlined the day's work for the ranch. The spring cattle drive to the railhead in Billings was still weeks away, but preparations had already begun. Fences needed mending, horses required training, and 100 other tasks demanded attention. "Is there anything specific you'd like me to help with today?" Josephine asked Martha when Samuel had finished. "The garden needs turning now that the rain has softened the soil," Martha replied, "and I thought we might inventory the root cellar to see what's left from winter stores." Samuel rose from the table. "I'll be working with the horses in the corral if you need me. Jake and the boys are checking the herd in the south pasture." He paused, seeming to consider something. "Josie, if you'd like to see more of the ranch, you're welcome to join me after you've helped Martha." The invitation surprised her. "I wouldn't want to interfere with your work." "You wouldn't be," he assured her, "and it might help you get your bearings. The E can be confusing for newcomers." Martha nodded encouragingly. "Go on, child. I can manage the root cellar inventory myself, and the garden will wait another day." Thus encouraged, Josephine agreed. After helping clear breakfast and assisting Martha with the morning's baking, she found herself walking toward the corral where Samuel was working with a young chestnut mare. He moved with confidence around the skittish horse, his voice a low, soothing murmur that Josephine couldn't quite make out. The mare's ears flicked nervously, but she didn't pull away as Samuel ran his hands down her legs, checking each hoof carefully. Not wanting to startle either of them, Josephine waited by the fence until Samuel noticed her presence. When he did, he gave the mare a final pat and walked over, wiping his hands on a cloth. "She's beautiful," Josephine commented, nodding toward the horse. "She's got potential," Samuel agreed. "Needs more training, but she's intelligent and willing. That's half the battle with horses." He studied Josephine for a moment. "Have you done much riding?" "Very little," she admitted. "Proper Boston ladies ride in carriages, not on horseback." A hint of amusement touched his eyes. "Well, out here, carriages are a luxury few can afford. Everyone rides, proper ladies included." "I suppose I'll have to learn then," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I could teach you," Samuel offered, then quickly added, "when time permits, of course." The offer touched her. "I'd like that, thank you." He nodded, seemingly pleased by her acceptance. "Let me just settle Copper here in her stall, and I'll show you around the ranch." As Samuel led the mare to the barn, Josephine found herself admiring the way he handled the animal firm, but gentle, with a natural authority that the horse clearly respected. It was the same quality she'd noticed in his interactions with Jake and the other ranch hands, a quiet leadership that commanded respect without demanding it. When he returned, Samuel brought another horse, a calm-looking bay gelding. "This is Rusty," he explained. He's about the gentlest mount on the ranch. If you're going to see more than the immediate yard, you'll need to ride." Josephine eyed the horse uncertainly. "Are you sure? I told you I'm not experienced." "Rusty could be ridden by a child," Samuel assured her, "and I'll be right beside you the whole time." His confidence bolstered her courage. With his help, she mounted the patient gelding, arranging her skirts as modestly as possible while seated astride. "It feels very exposed," she commented, gripping the saddle horn tightly. Samuel's lips twitched. "You'll get used to it. And out here, practicality trumps propriety when necessary." He mounted his own horse, a sleek black stallion, with practiced ease. "Ready?" At her nod, he led them at a slow walk out of the yard and toward the nearest pasture. Samuel proved to be an excellent teacher, offering quiet instruction on how to hold the reins and move with the horse's gait. By the time they reached the first fence line, Josephine was feeling more comfortable, though still far from confident. "The E-bar-E covers about 5,000 acres, Samuel explained as they rode. "Most of it is grazing land for the cattle, but we also have some fertile bottomland where we grow hay and other crops." He pointed out landmarks as they traveled distant buttes, a creek that ran through the property, the line of cottonwoods that marked the boundary with the neighboring ranch. Throughout the ride, he kept a watchful eye on Josephine, adjusting their pace to her comfort level and offering encouragement when needed. They stopped to rest on a small rise that offered a panoramic view of the ranch. In the distance, the mountains rose majestically, their peaks still capped with snow. Below, cattle grazed peacefully in verdant pastures, and the ranch buildings looked like toys from this height. "It's breathtaking," Josephine said honestly, taking in the vast landscape, so different from Boston. "Do you miss it? The city, I mean." Samuel's question seemed genuinely curious. Josephine considered before answering. "I miss certain aspects, the libraries, the concerts, the bustle of activity. But Boston held little for me after my mother died. My father's new wife made that quite clear." Samuel's expression darkened slightly. "Some people lack basic kindness." "She wasn't cruel, exactly," Josephine clarified. "Just disinterested in a stepdaughter nearly her own age. And my father was too enamored to notice her subtle hints that I should make my own way." "So you decided to marry a stranger and move west?" "It seemed like an adventure at the time," she said with a self-deprecating smile. "Now it seems more like foolishness." Samuel shook his head. "Not foolishness, courage. It takes bravery to leave everything familiar behind and start anew." His words warmed her. "That's a generous interpretation." "It's the truth as I see it." He gazed out over his land, expression thoughtful. "The West was built by people willing to take risks, to leave comfort behind in search of something better. Some find it, some don't. But the courage to try is worthy of respect." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, each lost in thought. Finally, Samuel straightened in his saddle. "We should head back. Martha will have dinner ready soon, and clouds are gathering again to the north." The return journey was easier, Josephine having gained some confidence in her basic riding abilities. As they approached the ranch yard, she found herself reluctant for the outing to end. Samuel's company was surprisingly easy. He didn't feel the need to fill silence with chatter, yet when he did speak, his words carried weight. When they reached the barn, he dismounted quickly and came to help her down. His hands were strong and sure at her waist, and for a brief moment after her feet touched the ground, they remained there, his face closer to hers than it had ever been. Josephine felt a flutter of something unfamiliar in her chest, not fear, but a kind of anticipation that left her breathless. Then Samuel stepped back, dropping his hands and clearing his throat. "You did well for a first lesson," he said, his tone deliberately casual. "We can continue another day if you'd like." "I would," she replied, hoping her voice sounded steadier than it felt. "Thank you for today. For everything." His eyes met hers, and for a moment the practiced reserve slipped, revealing something warm and genuine beneath. "You're welcome, Josie." The moment hung between them, fragile and charged with unspoken potential. Then, Martha's voice called from the house, announcing dinner was ready, and the spell was broken. They walked back to the cabin together, careful to maintain a proper distance, yet Josephine was acutely aware of his presence beside her, solid and reassuring. As April gave way to May, Josephine settled into the rhythm of ranch life with surprising ease. The work was hard, harder than anything she'd done in Boston, but satisfying in its tangible results. Under Martha's patient guidance, she learned to make soap from lye and fat, to preserve early spring vegetables, and to bake bread in the temperamental wood stove. Her riding lessons with Samuel continued when his work permitted, usually in the golden hour before sunset. He was an excellent teacher, patient but exacting, and Josephine found herself looking forward to these sessions with an eagerness that had little to do with horsemanship. Samuel himself remained something of an enigma. He was unfailingly kind and respectful, yet maintained a certain distance that Josephine found both frustrating and intriguing. There were moments like their first riding lesson, or when their hands accidentally touched while passing a plate at dinner, when something flickered in his eyes that suggested deeper feelings. But he never acted on them, never stepped beyond the boundaries of propriety. Martha, observing their interactions with knowing eyes, offered no comment beyond an occasional knowing smile. But her approval was evident in the way she increasingly arranged for Josephine and Samuel to spend time together, asking him to help Josephine hang laundry when Jake could have done it just as well, or suggesting Samuel show Josephine how to fish in the creek that ran through the property. On a particularly fine May morning, Martha announced that they needed supplies from Silver Creek. "Samuel," she said over breakfast, "you should take Josie with you. She's been here nearly a month and hasn't seen the town yet." Samuel looked up from his coffee. "The trail can be rough, and it's a long day's ride." "I'm a much better rider now," Josephine pointed out, unable to hide her eagerness at the prospect of seeing more of the territory. "That you are," he acknowledged with a small smile. "Very well. We'll leave after breakfast. Wear your sturdiest boots and bring a hat. The sun will be strong today." 2 hours later, they were on the trail to Silver Creek, Josephine riding Rusty while Samuel led the way on his black stallion, Shadow. A pack horse followed behind, ready to carry back the supplies Martha had meticulously listed. The journey gave Josephine a new appreciation for the vastness of the Montana territory. Miles of rolling prairie stretched in every direction, broken occasionally by stands of cottonwood trees or rugged outcroppings of rock. Wildflowers carpeted the grasslands in patches of blue, yellow, and purple, their scent sweet on the warm breeze. "It's so beautiful," she commented as they stopped to rest the horses by a small stream. "I never imagined the West would be like this. The books I read always focused on the dangers and hardships." "There are plenty of those," Samuel said, handing her a canteen of water. "But yes, there's beauty too. The kind that gets into your blood and makes it hard to imagine living anywhere else." "You've never wanted to leave?" she asked, curious about this man who seemed so rooted to his land. He shook his head. "I went east once, to Philadelphia, when my father was considering expanding our cattle business, spent 3 weeks there and couldn't wait to get back to open sky." He looked around at the landscape, his expression softening. "This is home. Always has been." Josephine studied him, struck by his certainty. In her 22 years, she had never felt that kind of belonging anywhere, not in her father's house after her mother died. Certainly not in Thomas's promises of a future in Silver Creek. "You're fortunate," she said finally, "to know where you belong." Samuel's gaze shifted to her face, his eyes thoughtful. "Some people spend their whole lives searching for that knowledge. Others stumble upon it when they least expect it." Before she could respond to this cryptic statement, he was helping her remount, and they were on their way again. Silver Creek proved to be smaller than Josephine had imagined, a single dusty street lined with wooden buildings, most of them weathered by sun and wind. A general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and a handful of other businesses comprised the entire town. As they rode in, Josephine was conscious of curious stares from the few people on the street. A new face was clearly an event in a place this size, especially a female one. Samuel helped her dismount in front of the general store, tying their horses to the hitching post. "Stay close," he murmured as he offered his arm to escort her inside. "Silver Creek is mostly decent, but it's still a frontier town." The general store was a marvel of organization, its shelves crammed with everything from canned goods to bolts of cloth, tools to patent medicines. The proprietor, a portly man with impressive mutton chop whiskers, greeted Samuel warmly. "Erikson, good to see you. And who might this lovely lady be?" His curious gaze moved to Josephine. "Miss Josephine Miller," Samuel replied. "She's staying at the E-Bar E, helping Martha with the house." If the storekeeper found this arrangement unusual, he didn't show it. "Welcome to Silver Creek, Miss Miller. I'm Harold Perkins. Anything you need, you just ask." "Thank you, Mr. Perkins. It's a pleasure to meet you." While Samuel discussed ranch supplies with Mr. Perkins, Josephine browsed the store's offerings. She was examining a display of buttons when a woman's voice spoke beside her. "You must be the abandoned bride I've heard about." Josephine turned to find an elegantly dressed woman of about 40, regarding her with frank curiosity. Despite the frontier setting, the woman's attire would not have looked out of place in a Boston drawing room, from her fashionable hat to her kid leather boots. Yes, I suppose I am," Josephine admitted, surprised that news of her situation had reached the town. "Evelyn Whitaker," the woman introduced herself, extending a gloved hand. "I own the hotel and do what passes for dressmaking in this backwater." News travels fast in small towns, especially when it involves Thomas Blackwood abandoning yet another fiancé. Josephine's shock must have shown on her face, for Mrs. Whitaker's expression softened. "Oh dear. You didn't know there were others before you?" "No," Josephine managed, her mind reeling. He said I was the only woman he'd ever wanted to marry." Mrs. Whitaker made a sound of disgust. "That man's promises aren't worth the air they're spoken on. You're the third girl he's lured out here in the past 2 years. The others at least made it to town before he changed his mind." The revelation left Josephine momentarily speechless. She had been one in a series of dupes, not the unique object of Thomas's affections as he'd claimed in his flowery letters. "What happened to the others? The other women?" she asked finally. "One went back east, her father having sent money for the return journey. The other," Mrs. Whitaker lowered her voice, "ended up working at the Silver Slipper." She nodded toward the saloon across the street. "Not that I blame her. Options are limited for a woman alone out here." Josephine felt ill at the thought of how close she might have come to such a fate herself had Samuel not found her on the trail. "I was fortunate," she said quietly. "Mr. Erikson and Martha have been very kind." Mrs. Whitaker's gaze moved to where Samuel stood at the counter, his tall figure commanding even in such a mundane setting. "Yes, I imagine they have been. Samuel Erikson is widely considered the most eligible bachelor in the county, though many have tried and failed to catch his interest." There was something knowing in the woman's tone that made Josephine flush. "He's been a perfect gentleman. Our arrangement is purely practical." "Of course," Mrs. Whitaker agreed, though her smile suggested she wasn't convinced. "Still, it's fortunate for you both. He gets additional help at the ranch, and you get—" Her gaze traveled over Josephine's simple dress. "Security, at the very least." Before Josephine could formulate a response to this rather pointed observation, Samuel approached, having concluded his business with Mr. Perkins. "Mrs. Whitaker," he greeted the woman with a polite nod. "I see you've met Miss Miller." "Indeed I have," she replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I was just welcoming her to our little community and expressing my relief that she found such suitable accommodation after her unfortunate experience." Samuel's expression remained neutral, but Josephine sensed his displeasure at the woman's probing. "Miss Miller has been a welcome addition to the E-Bar E," he said simply. Then, turning to Josephine, "I've settled the account with Perkins. Is there anything else you need before we head to the cafe for lunch?" Grateful for the rescue, Josephine shook her head. "No, thank you. It was nice meeting you, Mrs. Whitaker." "Likewise, my dear." "Do come see me if you're ever in need of new clothes. I may be the only dressmaker in Silver Creek, but I learned my trade in St. Louis." With that, she swept out of the store, leaving a cloud of expensive perfume in her wake. "I apologize if she made you uncomfortable," Samuel said quietly as they followed. "Evelyn Whitaker considers herself the arbiter of Silver Creek society, such as it is." "She told me about Thomas," Josephine said, "that I wasn't the first woman he'd brought west under false pretenses." Samuel's jaw tightened. "I'd heard rumors?" "I'm sorry you had to learn that from a stranger." "It's better to know the truth," she replied, though the knowledge still stung. "At least now I can see my fortunate escape more clearly." His expression softened as he looked down at her. "You deserved better than Thomas Blackwood. Much better." The conviction in his voice warmed her, and she found herself smiling despite the uncomfortable revelations. "Well, I certainly found better company in the end." Something flickered in Samuel's eyes, surprise, followed by pleasure. He offered his arm again. "Let's get that lunch. The cafe makes a passable stew, and I promised Martha we'd bring back some of Mrs. Peterson's apple pie." The cafe was a small, clean establishment run by a cheerful widow who greeted Samuel like an old friend and fussed over Josephine like a long-lost niece. They enjoyed a simple but hearty meal, during which Samuel told her more about Silver Creek and its inhabitants. "The town's grown considerably in the 5 years since the railroad spur was built," he explained. "Before that, it was little more than a trading post." "It still seems very frontier," Josephine observed, thinking of Boston's paved streets and gas-lit storefronts. Samuel smiled. "That it is. But it serves its purpose. We get mail twice a week, can order supplies from as far as Chicago, and there's a doctor who visits monthly from Billings." "And Mrs. Whitaker provides a touch of Eastern refinement," Josephine added with a hint of irony. "Evelyn has her uses," Samuel acknowledged. "She keeps the hotel respectable, which matters when cattle buyers come through. And she does make excellent clothes if you ever need them." Josephine glanced down at her simple dress, suddenly conscious of how plain she must look compared to the elegant Mrs. Whitaker. "Perhaps someday. For now, Martha's niece's hand-me-downs serve well enough." Samuel's gaze followed hers, lingering briefly before returning to her face. "You make them look better than they deserve," he said quietly, then immediately seemed embarrassed by the compliment. "That is, they're practical for ranch work, which is what matters." The moment of awkwardness passed as Mrs. Peterson brought their pie, but Josephine treasured the rare compliment, tucking it away like a precious keepsake to examine later in private. After lunch, they completed their errands, picking up mail at the small post office and visiting the blacksmith to discuss horseshoes for the upcoming cattle drive. By mid-afternoon, they were on the trail back to the ranch, the pack horse laden with supplies. They rode mostly in companionable silence, Josephine reflecting on the day's revelations. Learning the truth about Thomas had been unsettling, yet strangely liberating. Any lingering doubts about her escape from marriage to him had been thoroughly dispelled by Mrs. Whitaker's information. But the woman's insinuations about Josephine's arrangement with Samuel troubled her. Was that how others saw her situation, as a convenient bargain between a stranded woman and an eligible rancher? The thought made her uncomfortable, not because it was entirely untrue, but because it reduced what felt like a genuine connection to mere practicality. "You're quiet," Samuel observed as they stopped to water the horses at the same stream they'd rested at earlier. "Are you tired? We can rest longer if you need to." "I'm fine," she assured him. "Just thinking about what Mrs. Whitaker said." Samuel's expression darkened slightly. "Evelyn Whitaker enjoys her position as Silver Creek's primary source of gossip. I wouldn't give her words too much weight." "But she wasn't wrong about Thomas," Josephine pointed out, "and she seemed to imply that our arrangement might be misinterpreted by others." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "People will talk regardless of what we do or don't do," he said finally. "But if you're concerned about your reputation—" "It's not that," she interrupted. "I'm grateful for your help, and Martha's. I just don't want to be a burden or a source of difficulty for you." Samuel turned to look at her directly, his blue eyes serious. "You're neither of those things, Josie." Having you at the ranch has been—" He paused, seeming to search for the right word. "A pleasure." The simple statement delivered in his straightforward manner touched her more deeply than any florid declaration might have. "Thank you," she said softly. "I've been happy there too. Happier than I expected to be after what happened." Something unspoken passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of feelings neither was quite ready to name. Then Samuel was helping her remount, his hands lingering at her waist a fraction longer than necessary, and they were continuing their journey home. As the E came into view, silhouetted against the setting sun, Josephine felt a surprising sense of homecoming. In just a month, this place had become more familiar, more comfortable than her father's house had been in the years following her mother's death. And the man riding beside her, solid and dependable, had become someone she looked forward to seeing each morning, someone whose rare smile could brighten her entire day. It was too soon to call such feelings love, especially given her recent heartbreak, but Josephine couldn't deny the warmth that spread through her whenever Samuel was near. As they rode into the yard, Martha emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. "There you are! I was beginning to worry." "No need," Samuel assured her as he dismounted. The trail was clear, and Josie rides like she was born to it now. The pride in his voice made Josephine flush with pleasure as he helped her down from Rusty. Martha, observing their interaction with knowing eyes, smiled to herself. "Well, come inside, both of you. Supper's almost ready, and I want to hear all about your trip to town." As they walked toward the cabin, Samuel's hand rested lightly at the small of Josephine's back, a gesture that might have seemed presumptuous a month ago, but now felt natural. Even necessary. And in that simple touch, Josephine felt a promise of something more to come when the time was right for both of them. The weeks following their trip to Silver Creek brought significant changes to the E. Preparations for the spring cattle drive intensified, with Samuel and his men working from dawn to dusk to ensure everything was ready. The herd had to be gathered from the far pastures, each animal inspected for health and fitness for the journey. Supplies had to be procured, chuck wagons prepared, and every piece of equipment checked and double-checked. Josephine found herself busier than ever, helping Martha prepare food for the cowboys and mending clothes and bedrolls. She also took on more responsibilities around the ranch house, freeing Martha to focus on the enormous task of provisioning the cattle drive. Though the work was hard, Josephine thrived on the sense of purpose it gave her. For the first time in her life, she was truly needed, not merely tolerated or viewed as an ornament. Her contributions mattered to the functioning of the ranch, and the knowledge filled her with a quiet pride. Samuel, despite his grueling schedule, still made time for Josephine. Their riding lessons continued, though less frequently, and he often joined her for a cup of coffee on the porch in the evening, both of them too tired for much conversation, but finding comfort in shared silence. One evening in early June, as they sat watching the sun set over the distant mountains, Samuel broke their comfortable quiet. "I've been meaning to talk to you about the cattle drive." Josephine turned to look at him, noting the lines of fatigue etched around his eyes. The past weeks had taken a toll on him, though he never complained. "What about it?" "I'll be gone for nearly 3 weeks," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Jake and 2 other hands will stay behind to manage the ranch, but I wanted to make sure you and Martha will be all right with me away that long." "We'll manage," she assured him, though the thought of his absence created an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. "Martha ran this place alone while you were on cattle drives before I arrived, after all." "That's true," he acknowledged with a small smile, "though she complains about it every year." "When do you leave?" Josephine asked, trying to keep her tone casual. 3 days from now, if the weather holds." He glanced at her, then away again, as if hesitant to say more. "Finally," he added, "I'll miss our conversations." The simple admission warmed her. "I'll miss them too," she replied softly. Samuel turned to face her fully, his expression unusually open. "Josie, He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "These past weeks, having you here, it's changed things. Changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand." Her heart quickened at his halting confession. "I feel it too," she admitted. "When I think about how we met, how lost I was that day, it seems almost impossible that I could feel so at home here now." "Is that what you feel? That this is home?" The question held a weight that belied its simplicity. Josephine considered her answer carefully. "Yes," she said finally. "More than anywhere has felt since my mother died. But it's not just the place, Samuel. It's the people. It's you." The last words emerged as barely more than a whisper, but in the stillness of the evening, they seemed to hang in the air between them, impossible to take back. Samuel's gaze intensified, and he reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and covered her hand with his own. "When I found you that day, crying beside that broken wagon, something told me my life was about to change. I just didn't know how much." The confession, so simply stated yet so profound, moved Josephine deeply. "I think perhaps we found each other exactly when we needed to," she said softly. For a long moment they sat in silence, his hand warm over hers, the connection between them almost tangible in the fading light. Then Martha's voice called from inside, announcing that pie was ready, and the moment was gently broken. But as they rose to go inside, Samuel kept hold of her hand a moment longer than necessary, his eyes conveying what words had not yet fully expressed. And Josephine understood that something important had shifted between them. A door had opened to possibilities neither had anticipated when she first rode home with him 2 months before. The morning of the cattle drive's departure dawned clear and crisp. The ranch yard was chaos as cowboys made final preparations. Horses nickered impatiently and cattle lowed in the holding pens. Josephine had risen before dawn to help Martha prepare a hearty breakfast for the men, knowing it would be their last good meal for many days. Samuel entered the kitchen looking tired but determined, his trail clothes dusty already from early morning work. He accepted the coffee Josephine offered with a grateful nod, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "Everything's ready," he told Martha, who was frying bacon with practiced efficiency. "Jake knows what needs doing while I'm gone, and I've left instructions about the south pasture fence." Martha nodded, her expression a mixture of worry and resignation. "You just focus on getting those cattle to market and yourself back in one piece. We'll manage things here." "I know you will," Samuel replied, his gaze shifting to include Josephine. "The E-bar-E is in good hands." Breakfast was a boisterous affair, with 8 cowboys crowded around the table, eating as if it might be their last meal. Josephine moved among them, refilling coffee cups and passing platters of food, conscious of Samuel watching her from his place at the head of the table. When the meal concluded, the men filed out with thanks and compliments to the cooks. Samuel lingered, waiting until Martha had gone to pack some last-minute provisions before approaching Josephine. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small object and placed it in her palm, a carved wooden horse. Small enough to fit in her hand, but detailed with remarkable precision. "I made it during the evenings. It's not much, but I thought something to remember our riding lessons by while I'm gone." Josephine stared at the tiny horse, touched beyond words by the gesture. The carving represented hours of work, each detail lovingly rendered by hands more accustomed to ropes and reins than delicate craftsmanship. "It's beautiful," she said finally, looking up to meet his gaze. "Thank you, Samuel." He smiled, one of his rare, full smiles that transformed his weathered face. "You're welcome, Josie." For a moment, they stood close, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Then Martha bustled back in, and the moment passed. Samuel tipped his hat to both women and strode out to where his men were waiting. Josephine followed Martha onto the porch to watch the departure. The scene was spectacular. 300 cattle beginning to move out, guided by skilled riders on horseback, dust rising in clouds as the massive procession began its journey toward the railhead at Billings. Samuel rode at the front, tall and straight in the saddle, every inch the capable rancher in command of his domain. Just before the herd passed out of the ranch yard, He turned in the saddle and looked back. His eyes found Josephine immediately, and he raised his hat in a gesture that felt intensely personal despite the distance between them. She raised her hand in return, holding the wooden horse in the other, pressing it against her heart. Then he was gone, swallowed by the dust and movement of the cattle drive, leaving Josephine with an ache of absence that surprised her with its intensity. "He'll be back before you know it," Martha said quietly beside her, her knowing eyes kind. "And perhaps by then, you'll both have figured out what's been growing between you these past months." Josephine didn't bother denying the older woman's observation. "Is it that obvious?" "To these old eyes, yes," Martha replied with a smile. "I've known Samuel Erikson since he was a boy. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." The revelation sent a warmth spreading through Josephine's chest. "It seems too soon," she confessed. "After Thomas, I mean. I should be more cautious." Martha snorted. "Love doesn't follow schedules or propriety, child. It comes when it comes. And what you feel for Samuel has nothing in common with whatever you thought you felt for Thomas Blackwood." "How can you be so sure?" Josephine asked, genuinely curious. "Because I've seen how you've bloomed here, like a flower finally planted in the right soil. And I've seen how Samuel has softened since you arrived, finding joy in simple moments that he used to let pass unnoticed." Martha patted her arm. "But there's no rush. You have time to be certain of your heart." With that reassurance, they turned back to the house, where work awaited regardless of absent cowboys and confusing emotions. The next 3 weeks would be challenging, but Josephine was determined to prove herself capable in Samuel's absence. And perhaps by the time he returned, she would have found the courage to acknowledge what was growing in her heart. The days without Samuel passed more slowly than Josephine had anticipated. Though there was plenty of work to keep her busy gardening, preserving early summer vegetables, helping Martha with endless household tasks, she found herself watching the Western Trail several times each day, knowing it was far too soon for any sign of the returning cattle drive. Jake proved to be a reliable presence on the ranch, checking in each morning and evening to report on the day's work and any issues that had arisen. He was unfailingly respectful to both women, though Josephine noticed he seemed more comfortable with Martha, who had known him since childhood. "Jake's mother died when he was just 12, Martha explained one evening as they shelled peas on the porch. His father turned to drink afterward and wasn't much use to anyone, least of all a growing boy. Samuel's father took Jake on as a stable hand when he was 14, gave him a place to sleep in the bunkhouse and 3 square meals. He's been loyal to the E-Bar-E ever since." These glimpses into the lives of the people around her helped Josephine understand the tight-knit community of the ranch. Everyone had a story, a reason for being there, connections that went beyond mere employment. It was a family of sorts, bound by mutual dependence and shared history. One afternoon in the second week of Samuel's absence, Josephine was hanging laundry when she noticed a rider approaching from the direction of Silver Creek. As the figure drew closer, she recognized the fashionable attire of Evelyn Whitaker, perched side-saddle on a glossy bay mare. Martha emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. "Well, this is unexpected," she muttered. "Evelyn rarely ventures this far from town unless there's gossip to gather or spread." Josephine smoothed her hair self-consciously, aware that her simple work dress and practical braid were a far cry from Mrs. Whitaker's elegant appearance. "Should I make coffee?" "Might as well," Martha sighed. "She'll expect some form of hospitality, though I doubt that's what she's come for." By the time Mrs. Whitaker dismounted, assisted by a flustered Jake who had hurried over from the barn, Martha had composed her features into a welcoming expression. "Evelyn! What a surprise! What brings you all the way out to the E-Bar-E?" "Martha, dear," Mrs. Whitaker greeted her with air kisses near each cheek. "I was delivering a dress to the Peterson Ranch and thought I'd continue on to check on Miss Miller." Her sharp eyes found Josephine. "I've been concerned about you, my dear, all alone out here with Samuel away on the cattle drive." "Hardly alone," Martha observed dryly. "I'm still here, as are Jake and the other hands." Mrs. Whitaker waved this away as if it were irrelevant. Of course, but a young woman in Miss Miller's position, well, I felt it my Christian duty to ensure she was faring well. Her tone made it clear that Christian duty was merely a thin veneer over curiosity. Josephine stepped forward, determined to be polite despite the woman's transparent motives. "It's kind of you to think of me, Mrs. Whitaker. I'm doing very well, thank you. Martha has been teaching me so much about ranch life." "How rustic," Mrs. Whitaker replied with a tight smile. "But surely you must miss more refined company? The stimulation of conversation beyond cattle and crops." Before Josephine could respond, Martha intervened. "We've just made fresh coffee, Evelyn. Won't you join us on the porch? The view of the western range is particularly fine today." Thus diverted, Mrs. Whitaker allowed herself to be guided to the porch and settled in a comfortable chair. Josephine brought out coffee and some of Martha's honey cakes, which the visitor praised with surprise that bordered on insult. "These are quite good, Martha. I had no idea you were so accomplished in the kitchen." "There's a lot about me you don't know, Evelyn," Martha replied pleasantly. "Now, tell us the news from town. Has the doctor made his monthly visit yet?" For the next hour, Mrs. Whitaker regaled them with Silver Creek gossip, who was feuding with whom, which businesses were thriving or failing, and, most interestingly to Josephine, news that Thomas Blackwood had left town unexpectedly. "Simply packed up and disappeared one night," Mrs. Whitaker said, clearly relishing the scandal. "Left owing money to half the merchants in town, including myself. I had made him a new suit that he never paid for." She turned to Josephine. "You had a fortunate escape, my dear. Though I must say, landing at the E-Bar-E was a stroke of luck few women in your position could hope for." Again, there was that insinuation that Josephine had somehow engineered her situation to capture Samuel's interest. It rankled, but she maintained her composure. "I consider myself fortunate indeed to have found such kind people when I most needed help," she said evenly. "Samuel, Mr. Erikson, and Martha have been generous beyond measure." Mrs. Whitaker's sharp eyes missed nothing. "Samuel, is it? Well, well, things have progressed quickly, haven't they?" Martha set down her coffee cup with a firm clink. "Evelyn, if you've come all this way just to fish for gossip, you'll be disappointed. Miss Miller is a valued member of this household, and her relationship with Samuel is their business alone." The rebuke, though gently delivered, was unmistakable. Mrs. Whitaker had the grace to look momentarily abashed before rallying. "I meant no offense, of course. I'm simply concerned for Miss Miller's reputation. A young, unmarried woman living on a ranch with an eligible bachelor. People will talk, you know." "Let them," Josephine said with sudden clarity. "I know the truth of my situation and my character. So does Samuel, and so does Martha. The opinions of those who would judge without knowledge mean little to me." Mrs. Whitaker blinked, clearly surprised by the quiet strength in Josephine's voice. "Well, I see you've developed quite a backbone since our last meeting." "The ranch life encourages self-reliance," Martha observed with poorly concealed satisfaction. After that, the conversation turned to safer topics: the weather, the price of beef, the plans for Silver Creek's Independence Day celebration. When Mrs. Whitaker finally took her leave an hour later, both Josephine and Martha exhaled in relief. "That woman," Martha muttered as they watched her ride away, "has made an art form of wrapping insults in concern." "She seems very alone," Josephine observed thoughtfully. "All that interest in others' lives, but who takes an interest in hers?" Martha looked at her with surprise, then nodded slowly. "That's more charity than most would offer Evelyn Whitaker, but you may be right. Her husband died years ago, and her only son moved to California. Pride keeps her from admitting she might be lonely." The visit, though trying, had reinforced something important for Josephine. In the 3 months since Samuel had found her beside the broken wagon, she had changed. The sheltered Boston girl who had traveled west with naive dreams had been replaced by a woman who understood her own worth, who could face down thinly veiled criticism with dignity. And much of that change, she realized, was due to Samuel's quiet belief in her capabilities, his respect for her intelligence, his patience as she learned the ways of ranch life. Even in his absence, his influence remained, strengthening her resolve to become the kind of woman who truly belonged in this wild, beautiful place. That evening, as she sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Josephine took the small wooden horse from her pocket. She ran her fingers over its smooth contours, remembering Samuel's shy expression as he presented it to her. Whatever was growing between them, this feeling that made her heart quicken at the thought of his return, it was nothing like her infatuation with Thomas. It was deeper, rooted in genuine knowledge of each other, in shared experiences and mutual respect. Martha's words came back to her. Love doesn't follow schedules or propriety. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps what Josephine felt for Samuel had nothing to do with timing and everything to do with finding the person who made her feel most herself, most alive. With that thought warming her, she tucked the wooden horse back into her pocket and went inside to help Martha with supper, counting the days until Samuel's return. The expected 3 weeks of Samuel's absence stretched into nearly 4 as unexpected complications delayed the cattle drive. A telegram arrived at the Silver Creek post office, which Jake collected during a supply run, explaining that heavy rains had swollen a river crossing, forcing the herd to take a longer route to the railhead. Josephine tried not to worry, reminding herself that Samuel was experienced and capable. Still, each day that passed without news strained her nerves further. She threw herself into work, helping Martha prepare for winter by canning fruits and vegetables from the garden, making soap and candles, and even learning to shoot a rifle under Jake's patient instruction. Every woman on a ranch should know how to handle a gun, Martha had insisted when Josephine initially balked at the idea. Not just for protection from 2-legged predators, but 4-legged ones too. A mountain lion won't care about your delicate Eastern sensibilities if it's hungry. So Josephine had learned, finding to her surprise that she had a natural aptitude for marksmanship. The precise, focused nature of shooting suited her methodical mind, and she found satisfaction in the clean simplicity of hitting a target accurately. It was during one such shooting lesson, on a clear morning in late June, that Jake spotted a cloud of dust on the western trail, the unmistakable sign of riders approaching. "That'll be the boss and the boys," he said, shading his eyes against the sun. "About time, too." Josephine's heart leaped at the news, though she tried to maintain a composed exterior. "I should tell Martha. She'll want to prepare a proper meal for their return." Jake grinned, not fooled by her attempt at casualness. "Sure thing, Miss Josie. I'll stable the rifle and get the corral ready for the horses." By the time the riders appeared clearly on the horizon, Martha had a feast in preparation: roast beef, fresh bread, vegetables from the garden, and 3 different pies cooling on the windowsill. Josephine had changed from her shooting clothes into a simple but becoming blue dress that Martha had altered to fit her perfectly, and had pinned her hair in a style that was practical, yet flattering. "You look lovely, dear," Martha commented as they waited on the porch. "Samuel won't know what hit him." Josephine blushed, but didn't deny the intention behind her careful grooming. Over the weeks of his absence, she had come to terms with her feelings. Now she just needed to determine if Samuel felt the same certainty. The returning cowboys rode into the yard with whoops and hollers, dusty and tired but clearly pleased to be home. Samuel rode at their head, his tall figure unmistakable even at a distance. Josephine's breath caught at the sight of him. Sun-bronzed and trail-worn but wonderfully. Finally here. As the men dismounted, handing their horses to waiting stable hands, Samuel approached the porch. He removed his hat, revealing hair that had grown longer during his absence and now curled against his collar. His eyes, when they found Josephine, lit with a warmth that made her heart race. "You're back," she said simply, unable to find more eloquent words in the moment. "I am," he replied, mounting the steps to stand before her. "It's good to see you, Josie." Martha, with the wisdom of years, quietly excused herself to check on dinner, leaving them alone on the porch. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, drinking in the changes that 4 weeks had wrought. Samuel seemed leaner, his face more weathered from sun and wind, a new scar visible on his forearm where his sleeve was rolled up. "You were delayed," Josephine said finally. "We were worried." The Yellowstone was flooded, he explained. We had to take the herd 20 miles upstream to find a safe crossing. I'm sorry if you were concerned. I knew you'd return when you could, she said, though in truth, she had worried far more than she wanted to admit. Samuel stepped closer, his gaze never leaving her face. I thought about you every day, he said quietly, about coming home to you. The simple honesty of his words moved her deeply. I thought about you too. The ranch wasn't the same without you. He reached out slowly, as if giving her time to withdraw, and took her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, warm against her skin. Josie, I'm not good with words like this, but these weeks away made some things very clear to me. Her heart hammered in her chest as she waited for him to continue, hardly daring to breathe. I know it hasn't been long since you came here, since what happened with Thomas, Samuel said carefully. And I don't want to rush you or presume anything, but I need you to know that finding you that day, beside that broken wagon, it was the best thing that ever happened to me. Tears pricked at Josephine's eyes, not of sadness, but of a joy so unexpected and complete that it overwhelmed her. It was the best thing that ever happened to me too, she whispered, even though it didn't feel that way at the time. Samuel's hand tightened on hers. I'm not Thomas, he said, a hint of fierceness entering his tone. I won't make promises I don't intend to keep. When I say I care for you, that I want you to stay here not as Martha's helper, but as... He hesitated, then continued with renewed determination. As my wife, if you'll have me. I mean it with everything I am. The proposal, so simply stated yet so profound, took Josephine's breath away. Though she had hoped for some declaration of feeling, she hadn't expected this directness, this certainty from a man who chose his words as carefully as Samuel did. I know it's sudden, he added when she didn't immediately respond. You can take time to think about it. I just needed you to know where I stand. Josephine found her voice at last. It is sudden, she agreed, watching a flash of disappointment cross his face before she continued. But sometimes the heart knows what it wants before the mind can make sense of it. When you found me that day, I was lost in every way that matters. But you didn't just offer me shelter, you offered me respect and purpose and the chance to discover who I really am. She took a deep breath, gathering courage for her own declaration. I love you, Samuel Erikson, not because you rescued me, but because of who you are, honorable and kind and steadfast. And yes, I will marry you, if that's truly what you want. The joy that transformed Samuel's weathered face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, then all at once dazzling in its intensity. It's what I want more than anything, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Then he was pulling her closer, one hand still holding hers, while the other came up to cradle her cheek with exquisite gentleness. May I? He asked, his eyes seeking permission. In answer, Josephine rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, both of them learning the feel of each other, then deepening as Samuel's arm encircled her waist, drawing her against the solid warmth of his chest. It was nothing like the brief, proper kiss Thomas had given her after their engagement. This was a promise, a declaration, a beginning. When they finally parted, both breathless, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. I've been wanting to do that since the day I taught you to ride, he confessed with a small laugh. I've been wanting you to, she replied, happiness bubbling through her like a spring. A discreet cough from the doorway interrupted them. Martha stood there, her expression a mixture of satisfaction and feigned disapproval. If you two are quite finished, dinner is ready. And those cowboys aren't going to wait forever. Samuel didn't release Josephine's hand as they turned toward the door. Martha, I've asked Josie to marry me, and she's accepted. Martha's face broke into a wide smile. Well, it's about time. I was beginning to think I'd need to lock you two in the root cellar to get you to admit your feelings. She bustled forward to embrace them both. I couldn't be happier for you, dears. James and Emily Erikson would have loved you, Josie. They'd be so pleased to see their son finally finding happiness. The mention of his parents brought a shadow of emotion to Samuel's eyes. quickly replaced by gratitude. "Thank you, Martha, for everything." The older woman waved away his thanks. "Save it for the wedding toast. Now come eat before everything gets cold." As they followed Martha inside, Samuel leaned down to whisper in Josephine's ear, "Welcome home, Josie. For good this time." And Josephine, her heart full to bursting, knew that the broken wagon wheel that had seemed like disaster 4 months ago had actually been the first step on the path to where she truly belonged. The wedding of Samuel Erikson and Josephine Miller took place on a golden Saturday in September, when the first hints of autumn painted the cottonwood trees along the creek in shades of yellow, and the air held the crisp promise of changing seasons. The ceremony was held on the E-Bar-E, on a grassy knoll overlooking the ranch and the distant mountains beyond. In the months between Samuel's proposal and their wedding day, Josephine had come to understand the full meaning of partnership on a frontier ranch. Samuel included her in discussions about the business, teaching her about cattle prices and breeding programs, listening to her suggestions with genuine interest. She, in turn, transformed the ranch house into a true home, adding small touches of beauty and comfort that made the solid log structure feel more welcoming than ever. Their courtship, though brief by Eastern standards, felt unhurried and natural. Evening rides became opportunities for conversation and discovery, learning the details of each other's lives before they met. Samuel told her about his childhood on the ranch, about losing his parents, and the weight of responsibility that had fallen on his young shoulders. Josephine shared stories of her mother, of growing up in Boston's refined society, of the loneliness that had driven her to seek connection through letters with a stranger. Physical affection between them remained proper, but increasingly difficult to restrain. Samuel's goodnight kisses grew longer and more passionate as the wedding approached, leaving them both breathless and impatient for the day when such restraint would no longer be necessary. Martha watched their blossoming relationship with evident satisfaction, though she maintained her role as chaperone with good-humored strictness. "I didn't keep this household respectable for all these years to have you two scandalize the territory a month before your wedding," she declared, when she caught them in a particularly heated embrace on the porch one evening. News of their engagement spread quickly through the scattered community. Reactions were largely positive, though Evelyn Whitaker made it known that she found the hasty courtship concerning and wondered aloud if there might be pressing reasons for the rapid wedding plans. Martha silenced such speculation with a few choice words delivered during Sunday services, after which even Mrs. Whitaker refrained from further comment. On the morning of the wedding, Josephine woke to find a small package outside her bedroom door. Inside was a silver locket containing miniature portraits of Samuel's parents, along with a note in his neat, precise handwriting. "They would have loved you as I do. Wear this today so they can be with us both. Until this afternoon, when I can finally call you my wife. All my love, Samuel." The gesture brought tears to her eyes, happy tears that Martha gently scolded her for as they prepared for the ceremony. "You'll have your eyes all red and puffy if you keep that up, and that's no way for a bride to look." The dress Josephine wore was not the elaborate gown she had traveled west in, with its painful associations of abandonment and betrayal. Instead, it was a creation of ivory silk and delicate lace that Mrs. Whitaker had made as a peace offering, proving that her skills as a dressmaker were indeed as fine as she claimed. Simple and elegant, it suited both the occasion and Josephine's newfound confidence in herself. As Martha helped her with the final preparations, pinning fresh wildflowers into her upswept hair, Josephine caught sight of herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman who looked back. Gone was the uncertain girl who had cried beside a broken wagon 6 months ago. In her place stood a woman with clear eyes and steady purpose, ready to commit herself to a life and a man she had chosen with her eyes wide open. "You look beautiful, child," Martha said softly, adjusting the locket at Josephine's throat. "Samuel won't know what hit him." Outside, guests had begun to arrive, neighboring ranchers and their families, the hands from the E-Bar-E in their Sunday best, even a few townspeople from Silver Creek, including a surprisingly subdued Mrs. Whitaker. Jake, appointed best man much to his embarrassed pleasure, paced nervously on the porch, awaiting his cue to escort Martha to her seat of honor. When the time came for Josephine to make her entrance, she paused at the edge of the gathering, suddenly overwhelmed by the significance of the moment. Then she saw Samuel standing tall and handsome at the end of the makeshift aisle, his eyes finding hers across the distance, and all hesitation vanished. This was right. This was where she belonged. The simple ceremony was conducted by the circuit preacher, a kindly older man who visited the scattered ranches and settlements of the territory on a monthly basis. His words about partnership, respect, and enduring love resonated deeply with both bride and groom, who had already begun to live those principles in their daily interactions. When Samuel took Josephine's hands in his to speak his vows, his voice was steady and clear, carrying across the assembled guests with quiet conviction. Josephine Miller, I take you as my wife, to cherish and protect, to respect and honor, to work alongside in good times and bad, from this day forward until death parts us. Josephine's response came from the depths of her heart, emotion making her voice tremble slightly but no less sincere. Samuel Erikson, I take you as my husband, to love and support, to respect and honor, to build a life within joy and in sorrow from this day forward, until death parts us. The simple gold bands they exchanged had been crafted by the blacksmith in Silver Creek, plain but solid, like the commitment they represented. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel's kiss was gentle but filled with promise. Appropriate for the public setting, but hinting at deeper passions to come. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with tables set up under the cottonwoods, laden with food prepared by Martha and neighboring ranch wives. There was music from a fiddle and harmonica, dancing on a wooden platform constructed specially for the occasion, and toast after toast to the health and happiness of the newlyweds. As twilight descended, lanterns were lit around the yard, casting a warm glow over the continuing festivities. Samuel found Josephine sitting for a moment at the edge of the gathering, watching the dancers with a contented smile. "Are you happy, Mrs. Erikson?" he asked, settling beside her and taking her hand in his. The new name sent a thrill through her. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly. "And you, Mr. Erikson? Any regrets about taking in a stranded bride all those months ago?" His smile was answer enough, but he spoke the words anyway. "Only that I didn't find you sooner." Later, when the last guests had departed and Martha had tactfully retired to her room at the far end of the house, Samuel led Josephine to the bedroom that would now be theirs. He had expanded and renovated the space in the weeks leading up to the wedding, adding windows that looked out over the mountains and building a larger bed frame with his own hands. "It's beautiful," Josephine breathed, taking in the care he had put into creating their private sanctuary. Samuel closed the door behind them, his eyes never leaving her face. "You're beautiful," he corrected softly. "I still can't quite believe you're my wife." "I am," she assured him, stepping closer to loosen his tie. "In every way that matters, and soon in every way that remains." The kiss that followed held none of the restraint they had practiced for months. It was deep and hungry, hands exploring with new freedom as buttons were unfastened and pins removed from elaborately arranged hair. When Samuel lifted Josephine into his arms and carried her to their bed, the last barriers between them, both physical and emotional, dissolved in the discovery of perfect belonging. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the quiet darkness, Samuel traced gentle patterns on the bare skin of Josephine's shoulder. "When I rode out that day and found you beside that wagon, I thought I was just helping a stranger in need," he murmured. "I had no idea I was finding the other half of myself." Josephine pressed closer to him, her head resting on his chest, where she could hear the steady rhythm of his heart. "Sometimes the best journeys lead us to destinations we never imagined," she replied softly. "I came west to marry a man I barely knew, and ended up finding a home and a love I never knew to hope for." Samuel's arms tightened around her. This is just the beginning, Josie. We have a lifetime ahead of us. And in the years that followed, that promise proved true. The E-Bar-E prospered under their joint stewardship, expanding its operations and weathering the inevitable challenges of frontier life with resilience born of partnership. Martha remained with them, eventually taking on the role of grandmother when children arrived first, a son they named James after Samuel's father, then twin daughters who inherited their mother's spirit and their father's determination. Josephine never forgot the broken wagon and the tears she had shed beside it, but the memory lost its sting, transformed into the beginning of a story she would tell her children on winter evenings by the fire. A story about how sometimes what seems like abandonment is actually an opening to something far better than what was lost. A story about a cowboy who hitched his horse and said, "Ride home with me," not knowing he was inviting not just a stranded woman, but his future, to join him on life's journey. And in the telling and retelling, the story became not just their own, but part of the larger tapestry of the West itself, a testament to the courage, resilience, and unexpected joy that could be found on the frontier by those willing to risk their hearts on the promise of tomorrow.